The screaming stopped around 3 a.m. In the woods outside Sama Lombardo, Italy, on January 17, 1998, the only sounds left were the whisper of wind through bare winter trees and the scrape of shovels against frozen earth. 6 figures dressed in black stood around a shallow grave, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At the bottom of that grave lay 2 bodies, Chiara Marino, 19 years old, and Fabio Tolli's, 16. Both had been beaten with hammers. Both had bullet wounds. Both were still breathing when they were thrown into the hole. As dirt began to cover their faces, one of the killers, a guitarist in a heavy metal band, paused to light a cigarette. He looked down at the grave with empty eyes, then turned to his friends and said something that would later echo through Italian courtrooms. "Satan will be pleased tonight." They buried Chiara and Fabio alive in that frozen forest, then went to a nearby bar to celebrate with beer and laughter. They would return to that spot many times over the next 6 years, sometimes to party, sometimes to perform rituals, always to remind themselves of what they were capable of. The grave became a shrine to their depravity, a place of power where they'd proven their devotion to darkness. But this was just the beginning. The group that called themselves the Beasts of Satan would kill again, and again. And the truth, when it finally emerged in 2004, would reveal something far more disturbing than a simple murder case. It would expose an entire subculture of disaffected youth who had twisted teenage rebellion into genuine evil, who had turned heavy metal music and occult imagery into an excuse for torture and murder, and who had operated for years in the shadows of Milan's suburbs while authorities dismissed concerns as moral panic. This is the story of how music became murder, how symbolism became sacrifice, and how a group of middle-class Italian teenagers transformed themselves into monsters. The periphery of Milan in the 1990s was a strange place for young people. The city itself was prosperous, cosmopolitan, a center of fashion and finance. But in the industrial suburbs and satellite towns surrounding it, places like Busto Arsizio, Sama Lombardo, Varese, life was different. These were working-class and lower-middle-class areas where factories were closing, where opportunities seemed limited, where teenagers felt trapped between their parents' traditional Catholic values and the modern world they saw on television. Into this environment came heavy metal music, arriving through magazines, bootleg tapes, and eventually the internet. Bands like Slayer, Mayhem, Venom, and Burzum sang about darkness, death, and Satanism. For most kids, this was just music, a way to rebel against their conservative parents, something edgy and exciting but ultimately harmless. They wore black clothes, drew pentagrams on their notebooks, and argued about which Norwegian black metal bands were the most true and KVLT. But for a small group centered around a guitarist named Andrea Volpe, the imagery became something more. They began to believe that the songs weren't just entertainment, they were instructions. The lyrics about sacrificing virgins and serving Satan weren't metaphors, they were commandments. The album covers showing inverted crosses and demonic figures weren't just artwork, they were religious icons. Andrea Volpe was 24 years old in 1998, a charismatic figure in the local metal scene. He played guitar in a band called Beasts of Satan, named after a song by the British band Venom. Andrea was intelligent, articulate, and deeply troubled. He came from a middle-class family, had received a decent education, but felt empty inside. He described later how he'd experimented with various philosophies and beliefs, always searching for something that would give his life meaning and purpose. He found it in Satanism, not the philosophical Satanism of Anton LaVey, which is essentially atheistic humanism with theatrical trappings. No, Andrea embraced what he believed was real Satanism, the worship of a literal devil who demanded blood sacrifice and rewarded his followers with power. He began collecting occult books, drawing elaborate sigils, and performing rituals in abandoned buildings and forest clearings. Around Andrea gathered a core group of followers. There was Nicholas Sapon, who would become the most violent of the group, a man with dead eyes who seemed to genuinely enjoy causing pain. There was Paolo Leoni, quiet and intense, who acted as the group's priest and conducted their rituals. There was Mario Maxiani, younger than the others, eager to prove himself worthy of their respect. And there were several young women who were attracted to Andrea's dark charisma and the forbidden thrill of what the group represented. They met regularly in the late 1990s, usually in the woods outside Sama Lombardo or in abandoned industrial buildings around Varese. They would drink, take drugs, listen to extreme metal, and perform what they considered to be satanic rituals. These rituals involved chanting, bloodletting, usually their own, and animal sacrifice. They believed they were accumulating spiritual power, that Satan was noticing them, that they were becoming something more than ordinary humans. Most importantly, they believed that to truly prove their devotion, they needed to make a human sacrifice. Chiara Marino was a pretty 19-year-old who had dated Andrea Volpe briefly. She was part of the same heavy metal scene, attending concerts and hanging out at the same bars. But Chiara wasn't as committed to the darkness as Andrea and his core group. She liked the music and the aesthetic, but she wasn't really a Satanist. She didn't believe in literal devil worship. To her, it was just a phase, something edgy and different to do while she figured out what she really wanted from life. This made her a problem. She knew about the group's activities, had attended some of their rituals, and had seen things that worried her. She'd watched them torture animals. She'd heard them discussing the need for human sacrifice. And perhaps most dangerously, she'd started to express doubts. She'd suggested to friends that Andrea and his group were taking things too far, that someone was going to get hurt. Andrea learned about these doubts, and he made a decision. Chiara had to die. Not just because she was a security risk, though she was, but because she would make a perfect sacrifice. She'd been part of their circle, which made her a traitor. She was young and relatively innocent, which Satan would appreciate. And killing her would bind the group together through shared guilt and shared sin. On the night of January 17, 1998, Andrea invited Chiara to meet the group in the woods outside Sama Lombardo. He told her they were going to have a party, maybe perform a ritual, nothing she hadn't seen before. Chiara agreed, perhaps thinking this was a chance to reconnect with old friends, perhaps not realizing the danger she was in. Also invited that night was Fabio Tollis, a 16-year-old boy who was on the periphery of the group. Fabio was small, shy, and desperate for acceptance. He'd attached himself to the beasts of Satan, hopping to find belonging and purpose. He had no idea that he'd been selected as the second sacrifice. When Chiara and Fabio arrived at the meeting spot in the woods, they found Andrea and 5 others waiting: Nicola Sapone, Paolo Leoni, Mario Maxiani, and 2 young women who were part of the group. Everyone was drinking and smoking, and the atmosphere initially seemed friendly. They built a fire, played music, and talked about metal bands and upcoming concerts. Then, around 2 a.m., Andrea gave the signal. What happened next was captured in horrifying detail in later confessions and court testimony. Nicola Sapone suddenly grabbed Fabio from behind, while Paolo Leoni pulled out a hammer. They beat Fabio repeatedly, fracturing his skull, as the teenager screamed and begged for mercy. Chiara tried to run, but Mario Maxiani caught her and threw her to the ground. Andrea Volpe calmly pulled out a pistol, a small-caliber handgun he'd acquired illegally, and shot Fabio in the head. The boy didn't die immediately. He lay on the ground, bleeding and semi-conscious, making gurgling sounds. Then Andrea turned the gun on Chiara and shot her in the mouth. She fell, bleeding heavily but still alive. What makes this murder particularly horrific is what came next. The group had dug a grave beforehand, anticipating this moment. They dragged Fabio and Chiara, both still alive, both conscious enough to know what was happening, to the grave and threw them in. According to later testimony, Chiara was begging them to stop, crying, asking why they were doing this. Fabio was trying to crawl out of the hole despite his head wounds. The group stood around the grave and began to chant. They invoked Satan, asking him to accept their sacrifice. They declared their loyalty to darkness. And then, while Chiara and Fubpa were still moving, still breathing, still desperately trying to escape, they began to shovel dirt onto them. The forensic evidence would later show that both victims were buried alive. Soil was found in their lungs, meaning they'd breathed in the dirt as it covered their faces. Their final moments must have been absolute terror, injured, in pain, unable to move, watching the darkness close in as earth filled their mouths and noses and eyes. After the grave was filled and covered with leaves and branches, the group went to a nearby bar. They drank beer, laughed, and according to witnesses, seemed to be in excellent spirits. Indra bought rounds for everyone. They celebrated their accomplishment as if they'd done something praiseworthy rather than monstrous. Over the following days and weeks, the group returned to the grave site multiple times. They performed rituals there, using the grave as an altar. They would stand on the spot where two teenagers were rotting in the earth and feel powerful, feel chosen, feel connected to something they believed was greater than themselves. But their sense of invincibility was false. Chiara Marana and Fubpa Tullas were reported missing by their families. Police investigations began, focusing initially on the possibility that they'd run away together or had been involved in drug deals gone wrong. The authorities interviewed Indra Volpa and the others, but without evidence or bodies, they had nothing to charge them with. The case went cold. The beasts of Satan continued their activities. They recruited new members, performed more rituals, and discussed further sacrifices. But holding the secret of murder is corrosive, especially for people who weren't as committed to the cause as they'd thought. Cracks began to appear in the group's solidarity. The years passed. 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. The grave in the woods remained undiscovered. Indra Volpa and his core followers went about their lives, working regular jobs, maintaining relationships, appearing completely normal to outsiders. But the weight of what they'd done changed them. Nukala Suppan became more violent and unstable. The young women who'd participated in the murder struggled with guilt and addiction. Only Indra seemed unaffected, his belief in his satanic mission never wavering. In 2004, the group killed again. The victim was Marangela Puzzata, a 27-year-old woman who had been Indra Volpa's girlfriend. Marangela had initially been fascinated by Indra's dark philosophy and had participated in some of the group's rituals. But like Chiara Marana before her, she'd begun to have doubts. More dangerously, she'd learned details about the 1998 murders. On the night of January 24, 2004, Marangela was at a party with Indra and other members of the Beasts of Satan. They were drinking heavily and taking drugs. At some point, Marangela and Indra had an argument. The exact content of that argument is disputed, but witnesses later testified that Marangela threatened to go to the police about what she knew. Indra made another decision. He instructed his followers to take Marangela to a nearby house where they often met. There, in a scene reminiscent of the 1998 murders, the group attacked her. They beat her with fists and blunt objects. They stabbed her multiple times. And then, while she was still alive but incapacitated, they drove her to a remote location and threw her off a cliff. Marangela Puzzata's body was discovered within days, unlike the 1998 victims who remained hidden for years. The visible trauma on her body, the beatings, the stab wounds, immediately suggested foul play. Police began investigating everyone who'd been at the party that night, including Indra Volpa. This time the investigation would break the case wide open. One of the young women who had been present at Marangela's murder couldn't live with the guilt. Her name was Elizabeth Balaran, and she'd been on the periphery of the Beasts of Satan for years. She'd witnessed terrible things, participated in rituals, kept silent about murders. But Marangela's death was too much. The woman had been her friend. Elizabeth went to the police in February 2004 and confessed everything. She told them about the Beasts of Satan, about Indra Volpa's satanic beliefs, about the rituals and the sacrifices. Most importantly, she told them about Chiara Marana and Fubpa Tullas, murdered 6 years earlier and buried in the woods outside Samalumbada. The police were initially skeptical. The story sounded like something from a horror movie: satanic cults, human sacrifices, bodies buried in the forest. This was Italy in 2004, not medieval Europe. Surely this was the invention of a disturbed mind, or perhaps an attempt to deflect blame onto others for Marangela's death. But Elizabeth provided specific details. She described the location of the grave, the weapons used, the names of everyone involved. She drew maps. She offered to take police to the exact spot where Chiara and Fubpa were buried. On February 16, 2004, police and forensic teams traveled to the woods outside Samalumbada. Using Elizabeth's directions, they began to dig. Within hours, they found human remains. 2 bodies, badly decomposed after 6 years in the ground, but identifiable through dental records and DNA testing. Chiara Marana and Fubpa Tullas had been found. The grave site itself told a horrific story. The bodies had been buried face down, their hands still showing defensive wounds where they'd tried to protect themselves from the hammer blows. Soil in their airways confirmed they'd been buried alive. And scattered around the grave, investigators found evidence of the rituals that had been performed there: wax from black candles, animal bones arranged in patterns, occult symbols carved into trees. The arrests came swiftly. Indra Volpa, Nicola Suppan, Paula Lunny, Mario McSunny, and several others were taken into custody. During interrogations, the full scope of the beasts of Satan's activities emerged. This wasn't just about 3 murders. It was about years of ritualized violence, animal torture, grave desecration, and a genuine belief that they were serving supernatural evil. Some of those arrested immediately confessed, perhaps relieved to finally release the burden of their secrets. Others maintained their innocence, claiming they'd been present at the murders but hadn't participated, or that they'd been too intoxicated to remember what happened. Indra Volpa initially denied everything, then eventually admitted to the killings but claimed they'd been justified as religious sacrifices, that Satan had demanded them, that he'd had no choice. The trial of the beasts of Satan began in 2005 and became a media sensation across Italy. The country was both horrified and fascinated by the details that emerged. Here were ordinary young people from decent families who had somehow transformed into killers. They weren't impoverished, weren't abused, weren't obviously mentally ill. They were middle-class kids who liked heavy metal music and had taken their fantasies too far. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They had Elizabeth Belleron's testimony, the bodies and forensic evidence from the grave, and eventually confessions from multiple defendants. They brought in experts on occult beliefs who explained that what the beasts of Satan practiced wasn't any recognized form of Satanism, but rather a homemade amalgamation of horror movie imagery, black metal aesthetics, and genuine sadism. The defense attorneys struggled. How do you defend people who buried teenagers alive as sacrifices to Satan? Some tried to argue diminished capacity due to drug use. Others suggested that the defendants were victims themselves, brainwashed by Indra Volpa's charismatic leadership. A few attempted to claim that this was all just teenage rebellion gone wrong, that the defendants hadn't really believed in Satan and hadn't intended to kill anyone. But the evidence was damning. Witnesses testified about the group's activities over the years. Police presented journals and drawings found in the defendants' homes, filled with violent fantasies and occult symbolism. They played recordings of phone conversations where group members discussed the murders casually, sometimes laughing about what they'd done. Perhaps most chilling was the testimony from forensic psychologists who had examined the defendants. They found that most of the group members showed no signs of serious mental illness. They weren't psychotic or delusional in the clinical sense. They'd made conscious choices to participate in murder, motivated by a desire for belonging, excitement, and a sense of power that their ordinary lives didn't provide. Indra Volpa was the exception. The psychologists found him to have severe personality disorders and genuinely held beliefs in supernatural evil. But even this didn't excuse his actions. He'd known right from wrong. He'd planned the murders carefully. He'd understood that what he was doing was illegal and would hurt people. He'd simply chosen to do it anyway because he believed the spiritual rewards outweighed the earthly consequences. The verdicts came in 2006. Andrea Volpe was sentenced to 30 years in prison for his role in all three murders. Nicola Sapone received 27 years. Paolo Leoni got 24 years. The others received sentences ranging from 15 to 24 years, depending on their level of participation. Elizabeth Ballerin, who had turned state's witness and cooperated fully with prosecutors, received a reduced sentence of 7 years. But the case wasn't over. In 2007, during a review of the evidence, prosecutors discovered something that led to additional charges. While examining Andrea Volpe's personal belongings seized during his arrest, they found journals detailing other victims, people the beasts of Satan had allegedly harmed or killed, whose cases had never been connected to the group. One entry in particular caught investigators' attention. Andrea had written about a friend named Luca who had died in 2002 in what had been ruled a motorcycle accident. But Andrea's journal suggested otherwise. It described how Luca had discovered the truth about Chiara and Fabio's murders and had threatened to go to police. It detailed how the group had staged his death to look like an accident. Luca's body was exhumed. The new forensic examination revealed injuries inconsistent with a motorcycle crash. He'd been beaten before his death, and there were traces of drugs in his system that he'd never been known to use. The case was reopened, and Andrea Volpe was charged with a fourth murder. He was eventually convicted, and his sentence was extended. The Beasts of Satan case raised profound questions that Italian society struggled to answer. How could this happen in a modern, educated, prosperous country? What made these young people susceptible to such extreme beliefs? Was heavy metal music partly to blame, as some conservative commentators suggested? Or was that just convenient scapegoating of a misunderstood subculture? The truth, as experts tried to explain, was complex. The music itself wasn't the cause. Millions of people listened to extreme metal without becoming murderers. But the imagery and lyrics had provided a framework that disturbed individuals could use to justify their violent impulses. The occult symbolism gave them a sense of purpose and meaning. The group identity gave them belonging and validation. What transformed these elements from harmless teenage rebellion into genuine evil was the presence of a charismatic leader like Andrea Volpe who truly believed, combined with followers who were willing to suspend their moral judgment in service of group cohesion. It's a pattern seen in cults throughout history. A leader with absolute conviction, followers seeking purpose, gradual escalation of transgressive behavior, and eventually, violence that seems justified within the group's twisted worldview. The Beasts of Satan case also exposed failures in Italian society's handling of troubled youth. Multiple people had observed the group's disturbing behavior over the years but had done nothing. Teachers noticed students drawing violent imagery but dismissed it as teenage angst. Parents saw their children becoming obsessed with death and darkness but assumed it was a phase. Friends heard concerning comments about sacrifices and violence but didn't take them seriously. There's a tendency to dismiss extreme teenage behavior as normal rebellion, to assume that kids who dress in black and listen to aggressive music are just going through a phase. Usually that assumption is correct, but sometimes, as the Beasts of Satan proved, the darkness is real. The question is how to distinguish genuine danger from harmless posturing without resorting to moral panic that stigmatizes entire subcultures. In the years since the convictions, the case has been analyzed extensively by criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists. It's become a case study in how group dynamics can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. The defendants weren't monsters from birth. They were kids who liked music and wanted to belong, who got caught up in an ideology that sanctioned violence, and who made terrible choices that destroyed lives, including their own. The families of the victims have struggled with unimaginable grief. Chiara Marino's mother became an advocate for missing persons, working to help other families whose children had vanished. Fabio Tolli's parents sued several of the defendants in civil court, winning damages that the convicted killers will be paying for the rest of their lives. Mariangela Pezzata's family withdrew from public life, unable to cope with the attention and the horrific details of how their daughter died. The surviving members of the Beasts of Satan who weren't convicted also faced consequences. Several suffered mental health crises and required psychiatric care. Some became addicted to drugs as they tried to cope with the guilt and trauma. A few attempted suicide. Even those who had been on the periphery and hadn't directly participated in murders found their lives destroyed by association with the group. The heavy metal community in Italy, particularly in the Milan area, was deeply affected by the case. Many bands and venues faced increased scrutiny and harassment. Concerts were canceled due to protests from religious groups and concerned parents. The entire scene had to defend itself against accusations that it promoted violence and Satanism. Most metal musicians and fans condemned the Beasts of Satan strongly, arguing correctly that the group's actions were a perversion of what the music represented. Heavy metal, they pointed out, is generally about catharsis, expressing dark emotions through art rather than acting on them. The theatricality and extreme imagery are meant to be symbolic, not literal instructions for behavior. But the damage was done. The phrase Beasts of Satan became synonymous with Italian moral panic about youth culture. Politicians referenced the case when calling for increased censorship of music and entertainment. Parents' groups used it as evidence that they were right to fear their children's musical choices. The nuanced reality that this was an isolated group of disturbed individuals, not representative of a broader subculture, got lost in the hysteria. Today, more than 15 years after the convictions, most of the Beasts of Satan remain in prison. Some have expressed remorse for their actions, participating in rehabilitation programs and meeting with victims' families to apologize. Others maintain that they were victims of circumstance, caught up in events beyond their control, and that their sentences were too harsh. Andrea Volpe, the group's leader, has shown little genuine remorse. In prison interviews, he's spoken about the murders in detached clinical terms. He no longer claims to believe in Satan. He says his beliefs evolved, and he now recognizes he was delusional. But he still seems unable or unwilling to fully accept responsibility for the horror he orchestrated. He speaks about the murders as if they were events that happened to him rather than atrocities he committed. The grave site in the woods outside Sama Lombardo where Chiara and Fabio were buried is unmarked now. After the bodies were exhumed and the forensic investigation concluded, the area was filled in and the forest reclaimed it. You could walk through those woods today and never know that 2 teenagers spent 6 years rotting in the earth there, that a group of killers performed satanic rituals on that spot, that this patch of ordinary Italian forest was once a gateway to hell. Perhaps that's appropriate. The physical evidence of the Beasts of Satan's crimes has mostly disappeared, but the psychological and social scars remain. The families will never recover from their losses. The communities where these murders occurred still grapple with how they failed to see the danger. And Italy, as a whole, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about what lurks beneath the surface of ordinary suburban life. The Beasts of Satan weren't supernatural demons. They were human beings, young, confused, angry, lost, who made the worst possible choices in their search for meaning and belonging. They proved that evil doesn't require special circumstances or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it just requires a twisted ideology, a charismatic leader, and people willing to abandon their humanity in service of something they believe is greater than themselves. The music they listened to didn't make them killers. The occult imagery they adopted didn't possess them with demonic forces. What destroyed them, and their victims, was something much more mundane and much more human. The desire to be special, to matter, to be part of something powerful, combined with a complete failure of empathy and moral reasoning. In the end, the beasts of Satan killed at least 4 people and ruined countless other lives. They terrorized a community and forced a nation to confront difficult questions about youth, music, religion, and violence. They turned suburban woods into killing fields and transformed normal teenagers into murderers. But they weren't beasts, and they weren't serving Satan. They were just broken human beings who chose the path of darkness and took others down with them. And that, perhaps, is the most frightening thing of all. Not that supernatural evil exists, but that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty when they give themselves permission to stop seeing others as human. The house where some of the rituals took place has been demolished. The bars where the group celebrated after murdering Chiara and Fabio have closed or changed ownership. The forest where the grave was located looks like any other forest in northern Italy: trees, undergrowth, the sound of birds and wind. There's nothing to mark what happened there except memory. But that memory is important. We need to remember the beasts of Satan, not as a cautionary tale about music or youth culture, but as a reminder of how easily normal people can become monsters when ideology trumps empathy, when group belonging matters more than individual conscience, and when the desire to be extraordinary leads to extraordinarily terrible acts. Chiara Marino, Fabio Tollis, Mariangela Pezzata, and the others harmed by this group deserved better than to become footnotes in a sensational true crime story. They were real people with real lives, real hopes, real fears. They died horrible deaths at the hands of people who saw them not as fellow humans but as objects, sacrifices, problems to be eliminated, stepping stones to spiritual power. The beasts of Satan are mostly behind bars now, serving decades-long sentences in Italian prisons. But the questions their case raised remain unanswered. How do we identify dangerous groups before they turn violent? How do we distinguish harmless teenage rebellion from genuine threats? How do we help young people find meaning and belonging without them turning to destructive ideologies? There are no easy answers, but perhaps the first step is acknowledging that evil isn't always obvious, isn't always exotic, isn't always other. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor's kid who listens to metal. Sometimes it wears band t-shirts and drinks at your local bar. Sometimes it buries its victims in ordinary forests and goes to work the next day like nothing happened. The beasts of Satan prove that the monsters aren't always hiding under the bed or lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they're sitting right next to you, looking perfectly normal, while planning their next sacrifice to the darkness they believe gives their lives meaning. And that's a truth more terrifying than any horror story could ever be.